Hi everyone, welcome back. It's day something or other of the Sealy challenge. You're definitely not seeing me at my best, that's for sure. End of another long day. But so help me. I swear by the gods of poetry, I will continue with the Sealy challenge and I will read a book of poetry every day for the 31 days of August. And I mean, I may end up on the 31st day filming from my bed in my pajamas, half asleep, but I will make it. So today we have another amazing book. Every book of poetry is amazing. Well, almost every poetry book is amazing in some way or another. But this time, just look at it. Just look at it. It's so good. To give you an idea of how it looks, this is a sort of a normal size book. I mean, not to say that you're abnormal, because you're the best. Look, it's just a little bit taller, and it's just so slim and delicious. And I saw that there's another version of it that is, I think, hot pink. And I don't get that really. Why the hot pink with sort of like a computerized looking font? I didn't get that at all. But this to me is perfect. Now, my friend Alice, she took one look at it and she said she doesn't like it. She doesn't approve of the sizing because it's going to go right to the back of her bookshelf and get lost. But I say, you know, if you really look after your bookshelves, you can do a lot with this. It's a perfect size for what it is. This is, by the way, The Trees Witness Everything by Victoria Chang. It's perfect for what it is because look how the poems look. There's 4 parts to the book. This is the first part. The second part looks like this. Isn't that superb? Look at that. Boxes of what looks like prose poetry. It's so enticing. And there's also something about it that reminds me of, well, now I see why they would have put the bright pink computer font. I could see how this might look like a phone, maybe, possibly. And then it goes back in the third section to the same as the first, as far as form goes. And then the fourth part has these delightful 3-line poems with the little dots in between. So there's the physicality of it. I was so excited to get my hands on this when I was in Melbourne recently. It had just come in the bookstore. I've been reading quite a few of the books lately on my Kobo, and it is a misery. If you can, please don't put up with e-versions of books. I mean, I like it because it's immediate and it's cheaper. I mean, once you buy the Kobo. And of course, there's also, you know, being in Australia, it's hard. It's sometimes hard to, well, it's almost impossible to get quick access to books, especially as I like to read a lot of American books, this one being one of them. But often it's available as an ebook, interestingly enough. So what do we have here? I've already shown you the 4 sections. I'm looking at my notes because there's actually a lot of interesting things to talk about if I can remain awake for them. The notes at the back, written by Victoria Chang, who is an accomplished poet, has had her previous book, Obit, was very well reviewed, much loved. She has a following, she has a reputation, and she's won a lot of prizes, a lot of awards. So in her notes, she says that for the first and I believe third parts, she decided to choose forms that are called wakas, and they are various Japanese syllabic forms. So the first line has so-and-so syllables, the second line so-and-so syllables, and it varies somewhat depending on which she chooses. So she's basically counting syllables. And the other constraint that she has put on herself is that she chose the titles from W.S. Merwin's titles. W.S. Merwin is another American poet. I'm hoping to read one of his books. I haven't read his books. Well, I've sort of dabbled in them, but haven't read them properly. It's actually dedicated, the book, to him. But she says in an interview that I listened to, I think, or maybe I read, that she chose the titles not because she was riffing off his actual poems. She just wanted to have a constraint, and his titles worked for that for her. Now, it's interesting because just by chance, the previous book I discussed was all about constraint as well, but it was about the classical constraints. So what was happening with the book is that we had the classical constraints, which had to do with meter and rhyme, and I guess a bit of narrative, but mostly meter and rhyme. And I think when a poet decides on that path, they're usually hoping to have a certain rhythm and a certain order and a certain sound that's very dependable, reliable to their work. With these constraints that Victoria Chang has chosen, I've been thinking a lot, and it was intriguing me. Truth be told, I just had a bath, and in the bath, it occurred to me that she's choosing these constraints for completely different reasons. Now, to choose to count syllables, that's not necessarily, in fact, I can pretty much guarantee it's not going to really have an effect on the musicality or the rhythm of the poems. It certainly didn't as I was reading through them, albeit they're very short. And I'm thinking now that the only other poet I've ever heard of who counted syllables, I mean, not that I'm, some professor of poetry, but I do know that Marianne Moore counted syllables. And until someone told me that's what she did, I didn't realize. If anything, counting syllables makes the poems more odd rather than more ordered and regular. And then with the titles, that's also an odd constraint because it's forcing yourself to begin. Victoria Chang is forcing herself to begin with an image or an idea that's really random. So in a way, what she's doing with her constraints is she's adding a randomizer to her work. And I think I'm going to make an educated guess that one of the things that she wanted to do was to add a certain weirdness, a certain surreal aspect to her poems, which they definitely have, which allows her to maybe mine some of her subconscious more easily. And I think it's worked for her, actually. These short poems vary in their surreal aspects. They're not so outrageously strange that you'd be put off. A novice poetry reader would be okay with them, I think. There's also a grounding in reality, which in fact is almost, but never quite a type of Instagram poetry. I said the phrase Instagram poetry while discussing Victoria Chang. I'm ashamed of myself, but it has to be said. It has to be said that when you're reading works that are this tiny, and a lot of them are aphorisms that some of them seem slightly twee, you're reminded of Instagram poetry. I am not one to judge Instagram poetry because I believe there's an audience for all kinds of poetry. But I imagine that if someone is watching this who really loves Victoria Chang, they take offense. I do not mean to offend whatsoever. I think it's actually one of the most interesting things about this book, how Victoria Chang manages to steer her way through very unusual images, thoughts, feelings, actions, symbols are used a lot, and she's able to steer her way and keep to the course of her own style while flirting with, on the one hand, the most obvious type of Instagram poetry, and on the other hand, the most difficult, the most obtuse language poetry. And I think that's what kept me going through this. It's not a book that feels urgent. It's a kind of book that you can pick up and enjoy in bits and pieces. And I think it's actually better that way. I forced myself to go through it, obviously, because of the Seeley Challenge, and I'm happy for it. I think this is a kind of book that I think I'm going to be picking this up quite a lot. Look, the themes are still, as in her previous book, Obit, which I have not read, but I have read about. A lot about death and her mother's death. There's also a lot about love, desire. It gets quite dark at times, and then it's buoyant, so it always pops up again. And then these really unusual images that I wrote down because it was almost like I was collecting shells. I was collecting these images that she had through her poems, and they kept returning again and again. Now, some of them really captured my imagination. For example, lemons that kept coming back, the rain, snow, hands, horses, which I thought was really interesting. I'm not a horse person, so for me, bringing a horse into a poem was exotic. A lot about time, and not only time as you'd expect it to be, as in this happened in the past, this is the present and the future, and talking about death and birth, but she has this way of talking about describing something she does, and then almost as an aside, she'll say, the horse stared at me, and then I went home, and when the horse stopped staring at me, I was 80 years old. She sort of like has these weird jumps in time. I really like that. The pronouns vary as well. Sometimes it feels like she's speaking to herself, sometimes to perhaps a family member or friend, sometimes directly to us, the readers. The prose poem boxes, as I call them, the first one is very, very romantic, and distressing because it's it's about when you love someone and they don't love you back. I thought it was very well done. The second section she explains and actually titles Marfa, Texas, because she was in Marfa, Texas for some sort of residency or fellowship. And then some of the third section was written for the Poetry Society of America, who had some sort of marketing deal with a coffee company, and so they put some of her short poems on the sleeves of coffee cups. I love that sort of thing. I love marketing. I don't know why this book has so little marketing. I think it's made for Instagram. I'm not sure why. I tried to look up, readings that she's done, and there's almost nothing that I can find. I don't understand that. It's a bit of a shame, but I mean, what would I know? I'm just a poetry reader in Australia. Then the last bit she calls love letters. They were commissioned by the LA Public Library for Mental Health Resilience. They put them in posters, or I think they put them in electronic kind of signs outside libraries to help keep people's spirits up. And that's when it got even a little bit more twee than I was prepared for. For example, there is a bird and a stone in your body. Your job is not to kill the bird with the stone. I mean, I like it, but it's written for a specific reason. And in comparison to that, you have some absolutely, completely different poems towards the beginning. I like the way sometimes she talks about age as a garment that you wear. For example, this poem is called Convenience. Youth stretches over everything, can be used once, then we turn it inside out. Love that. It's very compelling, and a very cool introduction to Victoria Chang, if that's what you're after. This is something that you can carry around with you, and pick it up when you're waiting at the doctor's, or on your coffee break. It'll always give you something. It'll definitely give you something. A little hit. It'll give you a little poetry hit. Okay, so I am done for today. Looking forward to tomorrow. I am enjoying this, as you can tell, really, really enjoying it. So don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for playing along with me. Ciao.